There is a version of the Cold War that most people carry in their heads. It involves two superpowers staring at each other across a vast ideological divide, each side armed, each side cautious, both choosing again and again not to pull the trigger. In this version, the Cold War was a long, uncomfortable standoff that ended when one side ran out of money and political will. It was tense, yes. It was expensive, certainly, but it was, by most accounts, a peace. A strange peace, a heavily armed peace, but a peace nonetheless. That version is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete in ways that matter enormously, because what the official record eventually revealed, in documents declassified over decades, in memoirs written by men who had spent their careers keeping secrets, in interviews conducted with aging officers who had finally decided that the world deserved to know, was something considerably darker. What those records showed was that the Cold War was not a managed standoff between rational actors who always chose restraint. It was a decades-long sequence of accidents, system failures, miscommunications, and automated responses that came within hours, sometimes minutes, of triggering a nuclear exchange that would have killed hundreds of millions of people. The restraint that preserved the world was not always wisdom. It was not always doctrine or strategy or deliberate choice. Sometimes it was a malfunctioning censor. Sometimes it was a single man in a dark room who decided, without authorization, without precedent, and in direct contradiction of everything his instruments were telling him, that the data had to be wrong. The Cold War was survived not because the systems worked, but because enough of them failed at the right moments, and because enough individuals acted outside of their training at the precise instance when following protocol would have ended everything. What follows is not a dramatization. It is not speculation dressed in the language of history. Every event described here appears in official records, declassified government documents, congressional testimony, or the verified accounts of credentialed participants. Some of these facts were suppressed for decades. Some were acknowledged only after the individuals involved had died or retired. Some are still disputed at the margins, where governments continue to argue over exactly how close things came, as if the precise measurement of near annihilation is something worth defending. The discomfort these facts produce is not manufactured. It is the appropriate response to accurate information. The Cold War began, depending on who you ask, somewhere between 1945 and 1947. The precise starting point was never formally declared, because the Cold War was never formally declared. It was a condition, not a conflict. A state of organized hostility between two nuclear-armed states that lasted for roughly 4 decades and shaped the foreign policy, domestic surveillance, military spending, and collective psychology of most of the industrialized world. By the time it ended, the United States and the Soviet Union had between them accumulated tens of thousands of nuclear warheads, had developed delivery systems capable of reaching virtually any point on Earth within 30 minutes, and had constructed bureaucratic, military, and technological systems that were, in their final forms, largely capable of initiating a nuclear war without direct human authorization. That last part is not rhetorical. It is a technical description of what was actually built. The first fact that sounds fabricated, but was thoroughly documented, concerns the nuclear weapons that the United States lost. Not metaphorically lost. Not transferred without proper paperwork. Physically lost. In crashes, in mid-air collisions, in ditching operations at sea, in accidents so poorly managed that the weapons involved were never recovered. The official term for these events was Broken Arrow. Between 1950 and 1980, the United States officially acknowledged 32 Broken Arrow incidents. 32 separate accidents involving nuclear weapons. The number of weapons involved in those incidents is harder to pin down because some reports remain partially classified, but the confirmed losses include at least a handful of devices that were never retrieved. There is a hydrogen bomb somewhere in the waters off the coast of Georgia, near Tybee Island, that has been lying on the ocean floor since 1958. A B-47 bomber collided with an F-86 during a training exercise, and the crew jettisoned the Mark 15 thermonuclear bomb to reduce weight and prevent a crash. The bomb was never found. The Air Force searched, the Navy searched, they found nothing. The weapon, which had a yield estimated at several megatons, remains somewhere in roughly 15 feet of water in Wassaw Sound. The Air Force eventually concluded that the risk of leaving it in place was lower than the risk of a recovery operation, and closed the file. The state of Georgia periodically requests a more thorough search. The Department of Defense periodically declines. That incident would be remarkable enough on its own, but it was not the most serious broken arrow event. That distinction belongs to a January 1961 accident over Goldsboro, North Carolina. A B-52 carrying two Mark 39 hydrogen bombs broke apart in mid-air during a routine flight. Both bombs were released. One fell in a relatively controlled manner and was recovered largely intact. The other fell in a way that activated multiple arming mechanisms. Later analysis, confirmed by a declassified 2013 document obtained by investigative journalist Eric Schlosser, concluded that 3 of the 4 safety switches on that second bomb had failed or been bypassed by the mechanical stress of the fall. A single low-voltage switch was the only thing that prevented detonation. The bomb had a yield of approximately 3 to 4 megatons. The wind direction at the time would have carried the fallout over Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York City. This information was not released to the public for more than 50 years. The relationship between American nuclear doctrine and what actually happened in practice was, throughout the Cold War, considerably more chaotic than the official record suggested. One of the most significant gaps between doctrine and reality involved the control of nuclear weapons stationed in Europe. During the 1950s and into the 1960s, American nuclear warheads deployed to NATO allies were often stored in configurations that gave host nation military personnel, including non-American officers, a degree of access to the weapons that was technically inconsistent with stated American policy. The issue was not rogue actors. The issue was that the bureaucratic and logistical realities of deploying thousands of weapons across a dozen countries while maintaining the fiction of absolute American control had produced systems full of workarounds and informal arrangements. A 1960 report by a weapons designer named Paul Bracken, later expanded into a book, documented how the permissive action link technology designed to prevent unauthorized use had not yet been installed on many deployed weapons. Some weapons were secured with combination locks set to the same code for all units in a given region, a code that had been widely distributed. The code was reportedly all zeros. This was not a conspiracy. It was an administrative decision made to ensure that American commanders could always rapidly arm their weapons in the event of a Soviet attack, prioritizing speed of response over security against unauthorized use. The Soviet side of this picture was, if anything, less reassuring. Soviet nuclear doctrine during the Cold War operated under a set of assumptions about American intentions that were, from the Soviet perspective, entirely rational given the information available to them, but that created a perceptual environment in which almost any large-scale American military exercise could be interpreted as preparation for a first strike. The Soviet intelligence apparatus during the Cold War was sophisticated, well-funded, and deeply paranoid in a way that was institutionally encouraged rather than aberrant. The KGB and GRU maintained extensive networks of agents and technical collection systems, but they also operated under ideological frameworks that predisposed them to interpret ambiguous information in the most threatening possible way. This was not a flaw in their system. It was, from their leadership's perspective, an appropriate response to a genuine threat. The Americans had, after all, developed atomic weapons first, had used them, and had publicly discussed using them again under various circumstances. The Soviets were not wrong to be concerned. They were, however, building decision-making systems on top of a threat perception model that left very little room for benign interpretation of American behavior. This combination of Soviet threat perception and the realities of large-scale military exercises produced one of the most dangerous periods of the entire Cold War in November 1983. The event is known as Able Archer 83, and for many years after it occurred, Western governments substantially underestimated how close it had brought the two sides to nuclear war. Able Archer was a NATO command post exercise, a simulation of nuclear release procedures conducted in a realistic manner to test NATO's ability to escalate from conventional to nuclear conflict. It was more realistic than previous exercises. It used new communications procedures. It involved the simulated participation of heads of state, including a cameo from the very top level of NATO political authority. It lasted 10 days and concluded with a simulated release of nuclear weapons. From the Soviet perspective, this exercise was nearly indistinguishable from the early stages of an actual first strike. Soviet intelligence had, for the previous year, been running an intelligence collection program called RYAN, which stood for Raketno-Yadernoye Napadenie, meaning nuclear missile attack. RYAN's purpose was to detect early indicators of an American preparation for a nuclear first strike, and it had identified a specific set of observable signals that would precede such a strike. Able Archer 83 matched a disturbing number of those signals. Soviet nuclear forces in Eastern Europe were placed on alert. Some bomber units were brought to a higher readiness state. The Soviet reaction was not publicized at the time. It was only when a KGB officer named Oleg Gordievsky, who was simultaneously working as a British intelligence asset, passed information about the Soviet response to his British handlers, that Western governments began to understand how seriously Moscow had taken the exercise. A subsequent American intelligence assessment concluded that the Soviet leadership had, at certain moments during Able Archer, genuinely believed that a nuclear attack might be coming. Reagan, upon learning this, was reportedly shaken. His diary entries from the period reflect a genuine recalibration of his understanding of how Soviet leadership perceived American actions. What is not reflected in most public accounts of this episode is the bureaucratic response, or more precisely, the relative absence of one. NATO reviewed its exercise protocols. Some changes were made. The fundamental structure of the exercises and the fundamental gap in threat perception between the two sides remained largely intact. The system that had nearly produced a catastrophic miscalculation was adjusted at the margins and then continued operating. The structure of American nuclear command authority during the Cold War contained provisions that were not publicly disclosed and that, if disclosed, would have substantially complicated the official narrative about presidential control of nuclear weapons. The official narrative held that only the President of the United States could authorize the use of nuclear weapons, and that a clear chain of command with multiple safeguards existed to ensure that this authorization was necessary before any weapon could be fired. The reality was more complicated. During periods when communication with the President might be severed, pre-delegated authority to use nuclear weapons had been extended to certain military commanders. The precise terms of this pre-delegation were highly classified and varied over time, but the basic structure was confirmed in multiple declassified documents. There were scenarios in which a commander in the field could authorize nuclear use without waiting for presidential authorization, because the system designers had concluded that waiting might mean not being able to respond at all. This was not a secret conspiracy. It was a documented feature of American nuclear war planning that was considered operationally necessary and was acknowledged obliquely in some unclassified strategic literature. But it meant that the singular presidential authority over nuclear weapons that was publicly represented as the foundational guarantee of responsible nuclear stewardship was, in practice, a conditional guarantee with exceptions built into it. The Soviet version of this pre-delegation problem eventually produced something considerably more alarming. Beginning in the early 1970s, Soviet military planners began developing what would eventually become the perimeter system, known in the West by the informal name deadhand. Perimeter was a semi-automated nuclear launch control system designed to solve a specific operational problem. The Soviet leadership recognized that a well-executed American first strike might destroy the Soviet command structure before Soviet forces could respond. If the General Secretary, the Defense Minister, and the senior military chain of command were all killed in the first minutes of an American attack, who would authorize retaliation? The answer the Soviet system ultimately produced was a network of command rockets that could, under certain conditions, automatically detect that a nuclear attack had occurred and then automatically broadcast launch commands to surviving Soviet nuclear forces without any human authorization being required. The conditions for autonomous launch were complex and involved multiple sensors and verification steps, but the end point of the system was real. There existed on Soviet territory a mechanism capable of launching nuclear weapons based on automated detection of an attack, rather than human decision. This system was confirmed by Soviet and Russian officials after the Cold War ended. It was not fiction, it was operational. The American intelligence community knew, or suspected, that something like Perimeter existed during the Cold War. What they did not know in detail was how it worked, what conditions would trigger it, or how reliable its sensors were. This uncertainty was itself a source of danger. If American planners did not know the precise trigger conditions for Soviet automated retaliation, they could not be certain that any large-scale military operation, nuclear or conventional, would not inadvertently activate it. The system's existence imposed a constraint on American planning that operated below the level of public awareness. In September 1983, a Soviet lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov was on duty at a nuclear early warning facility southeast of Moscow called Serpukhov 15. His job was to monitor satellite data for evidence of an American missile launch. Shortly after midnight on September 26th, the warning system indicated that an American intercontinental ballistic missile had been launched and was heading toward the Soviet Union. Then the system indicated a second launch, then a third, a fourth, and a fifth. The system was reporting a major American first strike. Protocol required Petrov to immediately report an attack to his superiors, who would then initiate the Soviet response. Petrov did not follow protocol. He looked at the data and concluded that it was wrong. His reasoning was not complex. The Americans, if they were going to attack, would launch hundreds of missiles, not 5. 5 missiles was not a credible first strike. It looked like a sensor malfunction. It was a sensor malfunction. The satellite system had misidentified high-altitude sunlight reflections from clouds as missile launches. Petrov reported a malfunction rather than an attack. The world did not end. Petrov received a reprimand for improperly filling out his duty log during the incident. He was not publicly acknowledged until more than a decade after the Cold War ended, when Russian officials confirmed the incident. The reprimand was eventually rescinded. He died in 2017. What makes the Petrov incident particularly significant in retrospect is not just the near miss itself, but the system context in which it occurred. Petrov's decision was not made in a vacuum. It was made during a period of extraordinary tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. 3 weeks earlier, on September 1, 1983, a Soviet Su-15 interceptor had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 07, a commercial passenger aircraft that had strayed into Soviet airspace. The incident killed all 269 people on board, including a sitting United States congressman. The American response was fierce. Reagan called it a crime against humanity. The rhetoric between the two capitals reached a pitch of hostility that had not been seen since the early 1960s. And it was into this environment, with both sides at heightened alert and the political temperature at near-crisis levels, that the Soviet early warning system reported 5 incoming American missiles. Petrov made his call not as an isolated technical judgment, but as a contextual human assessment in a moment when every institutional pressure and political reality was pushing toward escalation. He went the other direction. That this decision was made by one individual on one shift at one facility and that its outcome was entirely dependent on the judgment, temperament, and in some sense, the personality of that individual, is not a reassuring feature of the system that was supposed to prevent nuclear war. It is an indictment of it. The question of how many times something similar nearly happened, with less fortunate outcomes only avoided by margins even narrower than Petrov's, is one that the declassified record addresses incompletely. There are events that have been confirmed in detail. There are events that have been partially confirmed, where enough is known to establish that a dangerous situation occurred, but not enough to know exactly how close to catastrophe things came. And there are events that intelligence professionals and historians believe occurred, but that remain classified or unacknowledged. What can be said with confidence is that the Petrov incident was not an isolated anomaly. The early warning systems on both sides generated false alarms with a regularity that their operators became accustomed to, which created its own category of danger. The American NORAD early warning system produced several significant false alerts during the Cold War. One of the most serious occurred on November 9, 1979, when NORAD's computers began displaying a massive Soviet nuclear strike in progress. Missile warning centers across the country went to a high alert status. Duty officers began the process of notifying command authorities. Aircraft were readied. The National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski was awakened at 3 in the morning and told that 250 Soviet missiles were inbound. He had approximately 3 minutes to decide whether to recommend that President Carter be awakened, and the American retaliatory strike launched. He waited. Before the 3 minutes elapsed, confirmation arrived that the attack data was erroneous. There was no attack. A training tape, a simulation of a Soviet nuclear strike that was used for exercise purposes, had somehow been loaded into the operational warning system and had been processed as real data. The Americans had nearly initiated a nuclear response to a training exercise. Brzezinski later said that he had decided not to wake his wife before the alert was resolved, because there was no point in both of them dying if it turned out to be real. 6 months later, in June 1980, NORAD had another false alarm. This time, the displays showed 200 missiles, then 220 missiles, inbound from Soviet submarines. The alert reached a level at which military aircraft were ordered to start their engines and prepare to launch. The source of the problem was eventually traced to a faulty 46-cent computer chip in a communications device that was generating random data. The zeros and twos that represented launch counts were being replaced with random numbers by the defective chip. The system that was supposed to protect the United States from nuclear attack had nearly triggered a nuclear response because of a component that cost less than $1. These incidents were investigated, and the systems were improved after each one. But the improvement process was itself constrained by the fundamental tension at the heart of all nuclear warning systems. A system that is too slow to respond is useless if the attack is real. A system that is too quick to respond will generate false alarms that might trigger the very war it is supposed to prevent. Every design decision involved a trade-off between these two failure modes, and there was no resolution to this trade-off that did not leave significant residual risk on both ends. The engineers and strategists who built these systems understood this. They documented it. The documentation is available. The tension remains unresolved. One of the less frequently discussed dimensions of Cold War nuclear danger involved the weapons that were deployed on submarines. Submarine-launched ballistic missiles represented a significant component of both American and Soviet nuclear forces, and they existed in a command and control environment that was considerably more isolated and autonomous than land-based forces. Submarines, by their nature, maintained radio silence for extended periods. They operated in an environment where communication with higher authority was difficult, delayed, and sometimes impossible. The protocols governing when a submarine commander could launch nuclear weapons without waiting for authorization from the surface were, for obvious reasons, more permissive than the protocols governing land-based forces. The precise terms of these protocols were highly classified, but the basic architecture was reflected in unclassified strategic literature and was confirmed in various post-Cold War accounts. There were circumstances under which a submarine commander, unable to establish communication with the surface and operating under certain observed conditions, had the authority to launch. The submarine was, in a meaningful sense, a semi-autonomous nuclear weapon system. The specific operational experiences of Soviet submarines during the Cold War produced several incidents that illustrated this dynamic in the most concrete possible terms. In October 1962, at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a Soviet submarine designated B-59 was operating in waters near Cuba and had been subjected to practice depth charges dropped by American naval forces attempting to force it to surface and identify itself. The Americans were not aware that the submarine was armed with a nuclear torpedo. The submarine's captain, Valentin Savitsky, operating under the assumption that the war might already have started and that the practice depth charges were actual attacks, made the decision to arm and prepare to fire the nuclear torpedo. Under Soviet Navy protocols, firing the weapon required the agreement of the captain, the political officer, and the executive officer. The captain and the political officer agreed. The executive officer, a man named Vasily Arkhipov, refused. Because all three had to agree, the torpedo was not fired. The submarine eventually surfaced, and the crisis passed. The incident was not publicly known until 2002, when a conference in Havana brought together American and Soviet participants from the crisis. Former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, upon learning the details, said that this was not a close call. This was closer than anything he had previously been aware of. Arkhipav's refusal was not an act of insubordination in the conventional sense. He was following a version of protocol that required unanimous agreement rather than majority rule. His intervention was procedural, but it was also a human judgment made under extreme stress, in isolation, with incomplete information about whether to fire a nuclear weapon in contested waters during the most dangerous confrontation of the Cold War. The outcome depended entirely on one man choosing correctly. The system's safety margin, at that moment, was one vote. The Cuban Missile Crisis itself, which is the best documented near-nuclear war of the Cold War period, contained more dangerous moments than the public account typically acknowledges. The standard narrative focuses on the 13 days of public confrontation, the XCOM deliberations, Kennedy's quarantine announcement, and Khrushchev's eventual agreement to remove the missiles. What the standard narrative obscures is how many decisions during those 13 days came close to going differently, and how much of the eventual resolution depended on back-channel communications, private assurances that were never made public, and individual choices made without full knowledge of the situation. On October 27, 1962, which came to be called Black Saturday, 3 separate incidents occurred, that any one of which could have resulted in nuclear war. An American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile, killing the pilot. Under existing American rules of engagement, this attack authorized an American military response against the missile site responsible. Kennedy chose not to authorize the response, but the decision not to respond was not automatic. It was a choice made under pressure. Simultaneously, another American U-2 strayed into Soviet airspace over Siberia due to a navigational error. Soviet fighters were scrambled. American fighters armed with nuclear-tipped air-to-air missiles were scrambled to escort the errant aircraft out of Soviet airspace. The Soviet fighters turned back before the situation escalated further. But for a period of time, nuclear-armed aircraft from both sides were in close proximity in a moment of active military confrontation. And the B-59 incident, which has already been described, occurred on the same day. 3 separate near incidents on a single day, each one involving actual military operations, actual weapons, and actual decisions by people who did not have complete information about what was happening elsewhere. The fact that all 3 resolved without violence is not a testament to the stability of the system. It is a testament to luck, operating at scale. The formal resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis involved a public agreement, the removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American pledge not to invade Cuba, and a secret agreement, the removal of American Jupiter missiles from Turkey within a few months of the crisis's end. The secret component of the agreement was not disclosed publicly for decades. The Kennedy administration actively denied that any deal involving the Turkish missiles had been made, because publicly acknowledging such a quid pro quo would have been politically damaging and might have undermined NATO confidence in American security guarantees. Khrushchev, for his part, could not publicize the agreement without revealing that he had made a private deal, which would have undermined his position domestically. So both sides agreed, tacitly, to maintain a false public account of how the crisis ended. The actual resolution involved a secret bargain that was officially denied for more than 20 years. The documents confirming the agreement were eventually declassified. They are a matter of public record. The false public account was maintained as official history for the better part of 2 decades. This practice of maintaining official narratives that differed from documented reality was not exceptional in the Cold War. It was routine. The management of information, the active construction of false or incomplete accounts, was not peripheral to Cold War strategy. It was central to it. Both sides did it. Both sides did it systematically, institutionally, with professional staff whose specific function was to ensure that the public record did not accurately reflect events. The historians who have since reconstructed the actual record from declassified documents have done important work, but that work is inherently incomplete because the declassification process itself is selective and slow, and because some documents will never be declassified. One area where the gap between official account and documented reality was particularly stark involved the extent to which American and Soviet intelligence services had penetrated each other's most sensitive programs. The standard Cold War narrative presents the intelligence competition as a relatively balanced struggle between 2 sophisticated services. The actual record, as reconstructed from declassified documents and from the confessions and revelations of numerous agents who were identified after the Cold War ended, is considerably more complex. The Soviet intelligence services had, at various points during the Cold War, successfully placed agents or recruited assets at very senior levels of American and Allied intelligence and military establishments. The damage to American security from these penetrations was substantial. Some of it is still being assessed. The American services had their own successes, including Gordievsky, whose information about the Soviet response to Able Archer has already been described. But the overall picture that emerged from the post-Cold War accounting was of 2 systems that had been deeply penetrated by each other, that had made significant strategic decisions based partly on information that had been manipulated by the other side, and that had, on multiple occasions, been genuinely uncertain about whether the intelligence they were receiving was accurate or disinformation. This uncertainty about intelligence reliability had direct implications for the management of nuclear risk. If a senior American policymaker received intelligence indicating that the Soviets were preparing a first strike, how confident could that policymaker be that the intelligence was genuine? If the source was a Soviet defector or a recruited agent, how confident could American intelligence be that the defector was not a plant or the agent not a double? The methods used to test intelligence reliability were sophisticated, but they were not infallible, and the history of Cold War espionage is full of cases where planted information or turned agents successfully deceived their handlers for extended periods. The decision-making systems that governed nuclear response operated on intelligence that was, to a significant and somewhat unquantifiable degree, potentially compromised. This was known, at least in general terms, to the people inside those systems. The official response to this knowledge was to build more redundancy into intelligence collection, to use multiple independent sources, to apply rigorous analytical standards. The actual effect of this knowledge, operating on human beings who were responsible for making decisions of civilizational consequence, was to produce a kind of epistemological anxiety, a persistent uncertainty about whether the picture of reality being presented by the intelligence system was accurate, that was never fully resolved. The military exercises conducted by both sides during the Cold War served multiple purposes simultaneously. They were genuine tests of operational readiness. They were signals sent to the other side about capability and resolve. And they were, occasionally, cover for actual operations. This last function created a persistent problem for both sides' intelligence analysts, who had to distinguish between exercises and actual preparations for attack. The problem was made more difficult by the fact that both sides understood that the other side would use exercises as cover, and both sides therefore used exercises as cover, which made the exercise or real determination harder, which led both sides to assume that exercises that looked suspicious were more likely to be real, which made the analytical problem worse. This recursive dynamic was not a design flaw in Cold War strategy. It was an emergent property of two sophisticated military bureaucracies operating in mutual anticipation of each other's deceptions. The management of nuclear weapons by the United States Air Force during the Cold War involved a set of safety procedures and institutional cultures that, in retrospect, were insufficient for the task. This is not a speculative assessment. It is the conclusion of multiple official investigations and of the work of historians who have had access to the relevant classified documents. The Air Force bomber and missile forces that constituted the core of American nuclear striking power operated under intense pressure to be ready to launch on very short notice, and this pressure for readiness competed with the pressure for safety in ways that safety did not always win. The 1961 Goldsboro incident has already been described, but there were other incidents, less famous but no less alarming, that illustrated the same institutional dynamic. In 1966, a B-52 carrying 4 hydrogen bombs collided with a refueling tanker over Palomares, Spain. 2 of the 4 bombs landed intact. 2 broke open on impact, scattering plutonium over a large area. The Spanish government required a substantial cleanup operation that American officials initially described publicly in minimizing terms. 1,600 tons of contaminated soil and vegetation were eventually collected and shipped to a storage site in South Carolina. A 4th bomb landed in the Mediterranean Sea and required a 3-month naval search operation before it was recovered from a depth of approximately 2,500 feet. The contamination of the Palomares area was significant enough that cleanup operations continued for decades, and Spanish authorities have periodically asked the United States to complete a more thorough remediation. The request has been handled bureaucratically, with studies and assessments and procedural responses for over 50 years. 2 years after Palomares, in January 1968, a B-52 crashed while approaching Thule Air Base in Greenland, igniting a fire that caused the conventional explosives in all 4 of the hydrogen bombs it was carrying to detonate, scattering radioactive material over the ice. The crash itself was caused by a fire in the crew compartment that had started because a foam cushion had been placed too close to a heating vent. The crew had been flying an airborne alert mission, meaning the aircraft was continuously airborne and armed in a practice that, at the time, was a standard operational procedure designed to ensure that a portion of the American nuclear force was always in the air and therefore survivable. The Airborne Alert Program, known as Chrome Dome, had been running since 1961. The 1968 crash led to the suspension of Chrome Dome, but by that point, the program had been operating for 7 years, during which American nuclear-armed bombers had been continuously airborne over Greenland, over the Arctic, and over the North Atlantic. The risks inherent in maintaining a continuous airborne alert with nuclear-armed aircraft had been discussed within the Air Force. The decision to continue the program despite those risks was a calculated trade-off. The calculation, in retrospect, did not adequately account for the probability of accidents. The Soviet military's management of nuclear weapons during the Cold War is harder to document in detail, partly because Soviet-era records have been less thoroughly declassified than American ones, and partly because the Soviet and Russian governments have been less forthcoming about nuclear accidents and near misses. What is known from sources that include Soviet and Russian military officers who spoke after the Cold War, from intelligence assessments that have been declassified, and from the records of incidents that were impossible to fully conceal, suggests that the Soviet nuclear establishment experienced at least as many accidents and close calls as the American one, and possibly more. Soviet submarine accidents involving nuclear weapons or reactors were particularly numerous. The list of Soviet submarines that sank or suffered catastrophic accidents during the Cold War, several of them involving nuclear weapons or reactors, is long enough to constitute a pattern rather than a series of isolated incidents. The K-19 submarine incident of 1961, which was partially dramatized in a film released decades later, involved a reactor accident that killed several crew members and came close to causing a nuclear explosion that would have occurred in waters near a NATO exercise, creating the precise, ambiguous situation that both sides were attempting to avoid. The crew managed the crisis without outside assistance, partly because requesting assistance would have meant revealing the submarine's location and the nature of its mission. The decision to handle the crisis internally was not made on safety grounds, it was made on security grounds. The institutional priority was operational secrecy. The safety of the crew and the prevention of a potential nuclear incident were secondary. In 1968, a Soviet Golf II-class submarine, the K-129, sank in the Pacific Ocean. The cause of the sinking has never been definitively established, though the most widely accepted explanation involves a malfunction during a missile preparation procedure. The submarine carried nuclear-armed ballistic missiles and nuclear torpedoes. The American intelligence community detected the sinking through acoustic monitoring, located the submarine's approximate position, and eventually mounted a covert recovery operation, Project Azorian, that used a specially constructed ship, the Hughes Glomar Explorer, operated undercover as a mining vessel to attempt to raise the submarine from a depth of approximately 16,500 feet. The operation partially succeeded. A section of the submarine was recovered. It contained the remains of some crew members, which were given a military burial at sea. What it did not contain, or at least what American officials did not subsequently claim to have recovered, was the nuclear warheads. Whether the warheads were in the section that was not recovered, or whether they were recovered and the fact of recovery remains classified, is not publicly established. The CIA confirmed the existence of Project Azorian after its operational security was compromised by a media leak in 1975. The details of what was and was not recovered remain partially classified. The biological weapons programs maintained by both sides during the Cold War were another area where the gap between official accounts and actual activity was enormous, and where the actual activity represented a threat of a different character than nuclear weapons, but one that is no less significant when examined carefully. The Biological Weapons Convention, signed in 1972, prohibited the development, production, and stockpiling of biological weapons. The Soviet Union signed the convention. The Soviet Union also, after signing the convention, ran the largest offensive biological weapons program in human history. The program, known as Biopreparat, employed at its peak tens of thousands of scientists and military personnel, operated dozens of research and production facilities across the Soviet Union, and developed weaponized versions of pathogens including anthrax, plague, smallpox, and a range of novel engineered organisms. This program was not a small-scale hedging operation. It was a massive industrial enterprise. Its existence was confirmed in detail by several Soviet scientists who defected or emigrated after the Soviet Union's collapse, most notably Ken Alibek, formerly Kanatjan Alibekov, who had been one of the program's senior officials. The anthrax outbreak in Sverdlovsk in 1979, which killed an officially unacknowledged but significant number of people, was caused by an accidental release of weaponized anthrax spores from a Soviet biological weapons facility. The Soviet government's official explanation at the time was that the deaths were caused by contaminated meat. American intelligence suspected the true cause. The Soviet government maintained the contaminated meat story until 1992, when Boris Yeltsin acknowledged that the outbreak had been caused by a military program. A detailed investigation conducted after the Soviet collapse confirmed that the outbreak was the result of an accidental release from the Sverdlovsk facility, which was producing weaponized anthrax in violation of the Biological Weapons Convention. The number of deaths has been estimated at between 60 and 100, though some assessments suggest the true number may have been higher. The Soviet government's response to the accident involved not just a cover story for the outside world, but an active effort to conceal the event domestically, including confiscating medical records and silencing medical personnel. The American biological weapons program, which predated the Soviet one, had been officially terminated in 1969 by President Nixon, who unilaterally renounced biological weapons and ordered the destruction of the American stockpile. This decision was genuine. The destruction did occur, but the process of destroying a large stockpile of biological agents is not simple, and the records of that process, along with questions about whether the destruction was complete and whether all programs were included in the order, have been subjects of ongoing scrutiny by arms control researchers. More significant is the question of what the American intelligence community knew about the Soviet biological weapons program and when. The evidence from declassified documents suggests that American intelligence had significant suspicions about Soviet biological weapons activity for much of the period after 1972, and that the Sverdlovsk incident provided substantial circumstantial confirmation of those suspicions. The American policy response to this intelligence was muted, partly for diplomatic reasons and partly because publicly accusing the Soviets of violating the Biological Weapons Convention would have required the United States to reveal the intelligence sources and methods that had produced the evidence. The arms control process during the Cold War was, in its public presentation, an earnest effort by both sides to reduce the risk of nuclear war through negotiated limits on weapons and delivery systems. In its operational reality, it was something considerably more complex. The negotiations were genuine. The agreements that resulted, SALT I, SALT II, the ABM Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, represented real constraints on weapons programs and were taken seriously by their signatories, at least some of the time. But the negotiating process was also extensively penetrated by intelligence operations conducted with awareness that both sides were lying about various aspects of their programs and designed in part to shape the other side's behavior by creating treaty obligations that could be used as leverage in the ongoing political competition. The verification provisions of the arms control agreements relied heavily on national technical means, a euphemism for satellite reconnaissance and other intelligence collection, and the adequacy of these verification methods was a persistent source of disagreement and uncertainty. The cruise missile question illustrates this dynamic clearly. During the negotiations that led to SALT II, there was extensive disagreement about how to count and limit cruise missiles, which were at the time being developed by the United States as a significant new weapons delivery system. The definitional and counting questions involved in the cruise missile issue were technically complex, but they were also politically contested in ways that reflected each side's desire to limit the other's capabilities while preserving its own. The eventual provisions of SALT II regarding cruise missiles were widely considered inadequate by American arms control experts, partly because they were. The inadequacy was a feature of the negotiating process, not a bug. Both sides accepted provisions they considered inadequate because accepting an imperfect agreement was better than having no agreement at all, and because the domestic political pressures in both countries favored demonstrating diplomatic progress. The domestic political pressures on American arms control policy were shaped in part by the activities of organizations and individuals who were, in some cases, drawing on classified information to make public arguments for particular policy positions, and who were, in other cases, making arguments based on distorted intelligence assessments that had been selectively released to support particular policy positions. The Team B episode of 1976, in which a group of outside analysts was given access to classified intelligence and produced an assessment that challenged the CIA's more moderate view of Soviet military capabilities, is an example of how the intelligence process could be shaped by political objectives in ways that had consequences for policy. The Team B assessment concluded that the CIA had systematically underestimated Soviet military capabilities and intentions, and its conclusions were used to support arguments for increased American defense spending and a harder line in arms negotiations. Subsequent analysis, conducted after the Cold War ended when Soviet records became more accessible, found that Team B had significantly overestimated Soviet capabilities in several key areas. The intelligence had been selectively interpreted to support a pre-existing policy preference. This was not unique to Team B. It was a recurring feature of the relationship between intelligence and policy throughout the Cold War. The targeting plans that governed American nuclear weapons employment during the Cold War evolved from the relatively straightforward targeting of Soviet cities and industrial centers in the late 1940s into extraordinarily complex operational documents that specified, in minute detail, which weapons would be used to strike which targets in a Soviet counterpart, and with what timing and sequencing. The document that governed American nuclear targeting from the early 1960s onward was the Single Integrated Operational Plan, known as the PSYOP. The PSYOP was revised periodically, and its various iterations reflected evolving thinking about nuclear strategy, damage limitation, escalation management, and the specific requirements of targeting a rapidly growing Soviet nuclear force. What the PSYOP also reflected, by the time it had grown to its full size, was the institutional interests of the military services that contributed to it. Each service wanted its weapons and delivery systems to play a prominent role in the war plan, which meant that the PSYOP grew to include far more targets than any strategic analysis of damage requirements could justify, partly because each new weapon added to the American arsenal needed a target to justify its existence, and partly because the various service components of the PSYOP had incentives to add, rather than reduce. By the early 1960s, the PSYOP called for the delivery of thousands of nuclear weapons against targets throughout the Soviet Union, China, and Eastern Europe, with yields and delivery schedules calculated to achieve what the planning documents called required damage levels against specific target categories. The civilian casualties that would result from executing the full PSYOP were staggering by any measure. One early 1960s estimate, produced within the planning system itself, put the expected deaths from a full PSYOP execution at several 100 million in the Soviet Union and China alone, with additional tens of millions of deaths expected in Eastern Europe and additional deaths in Western Europe from fallout. These numbers were known to the planners who produced them. They were known to the officials who reviewed the PSYOP. They were known, at varying levels of detail, to the civilian leadership that was nominally responsible for nuclear policy. The knowledge did not change the plan. The plan reflected a logic of military effectiveness within a strategic framework that had been accepted, and the civilian deaths that would result were treated as consequences of military necessity rather than as the primary product of the plan. The distinction between these two characterizations is worth noting. There was a briefing given to President Kennedy shortly after his inauguration, in which he was presented with the full PSYOP for the first time. The details of Kennedy's reaction have been described in several accounts by people who were present or were told about it by people who were present. What those accounts converge on is that Kennedy was disturbed by what he was shown, that he found the plan's scale and its lack of flexibility alarming, and that he asked in various formulations whether there was any way to limit a nuclear war once it started. The answer he received, which was technically accurate given the plan as it existed, was that the PSYOP, as written, did not offer significant flexibility. It was essentially a full-scale execution or nothing. Kennedy subsequently ordered the development of more flexible options, and the later versions of the PSYOP did include lower yield options and more selective targeting choices. But the fundamental architecture of the plan, which required a large-scale initial strike to be credibly deterring, remained, and the civilian casualty projections remained correspondingly large. The question of what would actually happen in the aftermath of a nuclear exchange was addressed, in the most rigorous manner available to the era's scientific tools, by a series of studies and assessments produced throughout the Cold War. The most significant of these was the work that led to the nuclear winter hypothesis, which was developed in the early 1980s and published in a 1983 paper by Carl Sagan and several colleagues. The nuclear winter hypothesis proposed that the smoke and soot from the fires ignited by a large nuclear exchange would be lofted into the upper atmosphere, blocking sunlight and producing a dramatic and prolonged cooling of the Earth's surface. The agricultural consequences of this cooling would be severe enough to threaten the food supply of the entire human population, including the populations of countries not directly attacked. The hypothesis was controversial when it was first proposed, partly on scientific grounds and partly because it had obvious political implications. It was taken seriously enough to be subjected to extensive review and modeling, and subsequent assessments have generally confirmed that the basic phenomenon, often now referred to as nuclear autumn rather than nuclear winter to reflect the somewhat more moderate current estimates, is real. A nuclear exchange involving even a fraction of the weapons that existed during the Cold War could, through the mechanism of stratospheric aerosol loading, cause global agricultural disruption severe enough to threaten billions of lives. The political implications of this finding were significant because it meant that nuclear deterrence, which was premised on the idea that nuclear weapons protected their possessors by threatening unacceptable costs on attackers, was in fact threatening unacceptable costs on everyone, including the possessors. A successful nuclear first strike against the Soviet Union would, on the nuclear winter analysis, also destroy the United States, not through direct Soviet retaliation, but through the global climate effects of its own strike. This finding did not transform American or Soviet nuclear policy. It did not lead to dramatic reductions in nuclear arsenals. It became a feature of the academic and policy debate about nuclear weapons, was noted in various planning documents, and was then largely absorbed into the existing framework without fundamentally altering it. The systems continued to operate under doctrines that had been developed before the global effects were understood, and the adjustments that were made to those doctrines were incremental rather than fundamental. The psychological and institutional effects of working within the nuclear weapons establishment over extended periods were documented in several studies and personal accounts that emerged during and after the Cold War. The men and women who staffed missile silos, who maintained nuclear weapons in storage facilities, who flew the bomber patrols and crewed the submarines and manned the early warning centers, were subjected to a set of psychological pressures that were unusual, specific to their role, and not fully addressed by the institutional support systems available to them. The nature of their work required them to be simultaneously prepared to participate in actions that would cause mass death on a scale without historical precedent, and to maintain the emotional equanimity necessary to function effectively in their day-to-day roles. The psychological literature on how people managed this combination of requirements is sparse, partly because the subject was not a priority for institutional research, and partly because the security environment made systematic study difficult. What individual accounts suggest is that people managed it through various mechanisms, including compartmentalization, professional identification, and in some cases by simply not thinking about the operational implications of their work in direct terms. The personnel reliability programs that both sides used to screen and monitor nuclear weapons, personnel for signs of psychological instability, were more systematic in their institutional form than in their actual effect. The American Personnel Reliability Program, established in 1959, created a formal system for screening individuals who worked with nuclear weapons and for removing those who showed signs that might affect their reliability. The program identified and removed a certain number of individuals each year. What it was less effective at identifying was the kind of ordinary human dysfunction, substance abuse, depression, interpersonal stress that could affect performance without rising to the level of formal identification. Documented cases of nuclear weapons personnel who were found to have been impaired in various ways while on duty emerged periodically throughout the Cold War and were handled institutionally, but the cumulative picture they suggested of a large human workforce maintaining civilization-threatening weapons under significant stress with imperfect psychological screening and imperfect institutional support, was not one that was prominently featured in public accounts of nuclear deterrence. The Soviet approach to personnel reliability was somewhat different in its structure, but faced the same fundamental challenge. The political officer system, which embedded party representatives in military units at various levels, was partly designed to ensure political loyalty and partly to maintain behavioral standards. Its effectiveness varied across units and periods, and it added its own layer of institutional dysfunction by creating surveillance and reporting structures that affected the candor and cohesion of the units being monitored. The intelligence operations conducted by both sides against each other's nuclear weapons programs were among the most valuable and most difficult intelligence collection efforts of the Cold War. The value was obvious. Knowledge of the other side's nuclear capabilities, vulnerabilities, command and control systems, and war plans was of immense strategic significance. The difficulty was partly technical, since nuclear weapons facilities were designed with security in mind, and partly systemic, since any agent or technical collection system that provided access to nuclear secrets was of sufficient value that protecting it took precedence over acting on the information it provided. This last point had important practical consequences. On several occasions, American intelligence received information through sensitive sources that indicated dangerous activities or intentions on the Soviet side, and chose not to act on that information directly in ways that would have revealed the source's existence. The protection of the intelligence collection capability was treated as more important than addressing the specific threat that capability had identified. This was a rational institutional trade-off. It also meant that certain dangers were known but not responded to, for reasons of intelligence management rather than strategic calculation. The reconnaissance satellite programs that both sides developed were among the most significant technological achievements of the Cold War and among the least publicly acknowledged at the time. The American Corona satellite program, which provided photographic reconnaissance of the Soviet Union from 1960 onward, was classified for decades and was not officially acknowledged until 1995. The program's intelligence product was of enormous strategic value. It provided systematic coverage of Soviet military facilities, industrial sites, and transportation infrastructure that had not been accessible through other means. It allowed American intelligence to make much more accurate assessments of Soviet military capabilities than had been possible previously, and in doing so, it contributed to a correction of some of the more extreme overestimates that had characterized American intelligence assessments in the late 1950s. The missile gap, which had been a significant political issue and which had contributed to the defense spending debates of the late Eisenhower and early Kennedy years, turned out not to exist in the form that had been feared. The Soviets had fewer operational intercontinental ballistic missiles than American intelligence had estimated, and they were less operationally capable. This finding was known to American officials by the early 1960s, but it could not be publicly shared because doing so would reveal the reconnaissance satellite program. Kennedy knew during the Cuban Missile Crisis the actual size and disposition of Soviet strategic forces, and this knowledge informed his assessment of the balance of power in ways that the public and even most of his advisors did not fully understand. He knew that the United States had substantial strategic advantages. He also knew that the Soviets had enough capability to cause devastation sufficient to make any exchange catastrophic. This knowledge shaped his decisions in ways that his public statements during the crisis only partially reflected. The practice of maintaining official positions that differed from what was actually known extended to the representation of incidents involving American forces during the Cold War. The American government maintained for years that its aircraft had never penetrated Soviet airspace, a position that was demonstrably false given the existence of the U-2 program and various other reconnaissance flights that did penetrate Soviet territory. When Gary Powers was shot down in his U-2 over the Soviet Union in May 1960, the initial American response was to release a cover story claiming that a weather research aircraft had gone missing. Eisenhower personally approved the release of this false statement. The Soviets, who had powers in custody and had largely intact wreckage of the aircraft, allowed the cover story to be published and then demolished it by producing the evidence. Eisenhower was forced to acknowledge the espionage mission in one of the most public admissions of government dishonesty in American Cold War history. The damage to the Paris summit, which had been scheduled for shortly after the shootdown and was supposed to address a range of Cold War tensions, was substantial. The summit effectively collapsed. The U-2 episode was notable for producing a public reckoning with the practice of official deception that was unusual for the Cold War period. Most of the deceptions and false statements that characterized Cold War governance did not produce equivalent public reckonings. They were maintained, investigated after the fact, revealed in declassified documents, and added to the historical record without producing the kind of political accountability that might have changed institutional practice. The intelligence community learned from the U-2 episode to maintain more plausible deniability for its operations, not to conduct fewer operations that would require deception. The nuclear testing programs conducted by both sides during the Cold War had environmental and health consequences that were systematically underrepresented in official accounts for decades. The United States conducted over 1,000 nuclear tests, the majority of them underground, but a significant number of them in the atmosphere before the Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963 prohibited atmospheric testing. The fallout from atmospheric testing spread across the globe and deposited radioactive material in detectable quantities in locations far from the test sites. The health effects of this fallout were studied, were known to be significant, and were not prominently communicated to the affected populations. Residents of Nevada and Utah who lived downwind of the Nevada test site were exposed to fallout from dozens of tests during the 1950s and experienced elevated rates of certain cancers in subsequent decades. These populations came to be known as downwinders, and their legal and medical struggles for recognition and compensation extended for decades. The populations most severely affected by American nuclear testing were the residents of the Marshall Islands, which had been used as a testing site for the largest American nuclear tests. The 1954 Castle Bravo test, which had a yield of 15 megatons rather than the expected 6 megatons, the most powerful American nuclear test ever conducted, deposited fallout on inhabited atolls and on a Japanese fishing vessel, the Lucky Dragon, whose crew became severely ill. The residents of Rongelap Atoll, who had not been evacuated before the test, despite American awareness of wind conditions that would carry fallout in their direction, received radiation doses that caused immediate health effects and elevated cancer rates in subsequent generations. The United States government's response to the Marshallese population's exposure involved a combination of medical monitoring programs that provided some health services, while also generating research data, inadequate compensation, and official characterizations of the exposure levels and health effects that were less alarming than the evidence warranted. The full extent of the testing program's impact on Marshallese health and on the habitability of contaminated atolls has been the subject of ongoing legal and diplomatic disputes that have not been resolved. The Soviet nuclear testing program was conducted primarily at the Semipalatinsk site in Kazakhstan, where approximately 450 nuclear tests were conducted over 4 decades. The health consequences for populations living near the test site were severe. Studies conducted after the Soviet Union's collapse found elevated rates of cancers, birth defects, and other health conditions in populations living in the surrounding region. The Soviet government had maintained health monitoring programs for some of the affected populations, but the data from these programs was classified, and the populations were not informed of the specific risks they faced or the specific exposures they had received. When the classified data was eventually released after the Soviet Union collapsed, it confirmed that the health effects had been significant and that the government had known about them. The broader global fallout from Soviet atmospheric testing contributed to the same pool of worldwide contamination as American testing. The Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which ended atmospheric testing by the two major nuclear powers, was motivated partly by genuine concern about fallout and partly by strategic calculation. Both sides had developed sufficient underground testing capability to continue their programs without the atmospheric component, so the treaty was not a significant sacrifice for either. The health and environmental benefits of ending atmospheric testing were real, but they were a byproduct of a strategic calculation rather than a primary motivation. The development of the hydrogen bomb, which multiplied the destructive power of nuclear weapons by orders of magnitude, was accompanied on the American side by an internal debate about whether to proceed that was more substantive than its ultimate outcome suggests. The advisory committee chaired by Robert Oppenheimer recommended in 1949 against proceeding with an accelerated hydrogen bomb program, partly on technical grounds and partly on the moral grounds that a weapon of such potential destructive power represented a qualitatively different kind of armament than the fission weapons that had already been developed. This recommendation was overridden by Truman, who ordered the crash development program to proceed. The debate around Oppenheimer's recommendation and the subsequent security hearing that stripped him of his security clearance in 1954 has been extensively documented. What the documentation shows is that the decision to proceed with the hydrogen bomb was made in a political and institutional environment that treated opposition to the weapon as not just strategically misguided, but potentially suspect. The security hearing against Oppenheimer explicitly used his opposition to the hydrogen bomb as one element of a broader case against him. The message conveyed to the scientific and policy community was that certain questions about nuclear weapons were not suitable for legitimate debate within the security-cleared community. The secrecy apparatus that surrounded nuclear weapons throughout the Cold War had the effect, among others, of insulating nuclear policy decisions from the kind of democratic deliberation that governed other major policy areas. The basic architecture of American nuclear strategy, the targeting doctrine, the command and control systems, the criteria for first use, the authorization procedures, was determined largely within a small, security-cleared community of military officers, civilian defense officials, and selected contractors and academic consultants. The Congress played a role in nuclear policy primarily through the appropriations process, and congressional oversight of the specific operational aspects of nuclear strategy was limited by classification barriers. The public had access to general information about American nuclear policy, including the basic deterrence doctrine and the size of the arsenal, but not to the operational details that would have allowed a fully informed assessment of whether the strategy being pursued was actually achieving its stated objectives or whether the risks it entailed were proportionate to the benefits. This structural feature of nuclear governance, the combination of genuine operational security requirements with institutional preferences for secrecy that extended beyond operational necessity, meant that the community of people with full knowledge of Cold War nuclear realities was always small, and that the political accountability mechanisms that operate through public information were largely absent from the nuclear domain. The historians and journalists who have reconstructed the Cold War nuclear record from declassified documents have performed a function that the governance systems of the period did not perform, which is to make the relevant facts available to a broader community capable of assessing them. But this function is being performed retrospectively, and the decisions that were made in the absence of public accountability cannot be revisited. The arms race that characterized the Cold War nuclear competition was driven by a combination of genuine strategic calculation, institutional momentum, bureaucratic interest, and domestic political pressure, in proportions that varied by country, by period, and by the specific weapons system under discussion. The clean strategic logic of deterrence, which requires only enough weapons to reliably threaten unacceptable damage on an attacker, would not by itself have produced the tens of thousands of weapons that both sides accumulated. The actual production of that many weapons reflected factors beyond strategic logic. The military services that managed nuclear weapons had institutional interests in maintaining large, capable forces that were not simply derivable from deterrence requirements. The defense industrial base that produced nuclear weapons had economic and political interests in continuing production that created constituencies for particular weapons programs. The domestic political environment in both countries treated nuclear strength as a symbol of national resolve in ways that made unilateral restraint politically costly. These factors together produced arsenals that vastly exceeded any plausible deterrence requirement, and that themselves created risks of accidents, of miscalculation, of unauthorized use that were a direct consequence of their size. The economic costs of the nuclear arms race were staggering by any measure. The United States spent, by various estimates, several $1 trillion in constant dollars on nuclear weapons and delivery systems over the course of the Cold War. The Soviet Union spent a comparable proportion of a smaller economy, with consequences for the Soviet economy that were significant and that contributed, along with many other factors, to the conditions that led to the Soviet Union's eventual collapse. The opportunity cost of this spending, in terms of alternative uses of the resources consumed, were never seriously analyzed as part of the decision-making process that drove the spending. Defense appropriations were evaluated against strategic requirements, not against alternative investments. The strategic requirements were themselves defined by institutions that had interests in large appropriations. The feedback loop between strategic requirements and institutional interests was not fully transparent to the civilian leadership that nominally controlled it. The final years of the Cold War were shaped substantially by a Soviet leadership that was becoming aware, through multiple channels, of the extent of the Soviet Union's structural difficulties. Mikhail Gorbachev's willingness to negotiate seriously on arms control, to accept verification provisions that previous Soviet leaders had consistently rejected, and to allow the political changes in Eastern Europe that ultimately ended the Warsaw Pact, reflected a genuine strategic reassessment. But it also reflected the specific political and personal characteristics of Gorbachev himself, and those characteristics were not a predictable product of the Soviet system. The Soviet Union might have had a different general secretary in 1985. A different general secretary might have made different choices. The ending of the Cold War as it occurred was not structurally inevitable. It depended in part on contingent factors, including who happened to be in which positions at the relevant moments, in ways that the retrospective narrative of inevitable Soviet collapse tends to obscure. The disarmament negotiations of the late 1980s produced the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty of 1987, and subsequently the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty negotiations that led to START I in 1991. These were genuine achievements of arms control diplomacy. They produced real reductions in weapons numbers and contributed to the easing of Cold War tensions. They also left intact the basic architecture of nuclear deterrence and the basic command and control systems that had been built to manage it. The weapons that remained after the reductions were still more than sufficient to produce civilizational damage. The verification systems that monitored compliance were more robust than previous agreements, but they still operated within the limitations of national technical means and treaty-permitted inspections. The fundamental vulnerability of the arms control framework, its dependence on political will and institutional cooperation that could change with leadership changes, was not resolved. The Soviet Union's formal dissolution in December 1991 created an unprecedented nuclear governance challenge. The Soviet nuclear arsenal, which was deployed across multiple Soviet republics that were becoming independent states, was suddenly potentially subject to multiple claimants of sovereignty. Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus all had Soviet nuclear weapons on their territory. The question of who controlled those weapons and what would happen to them was one of the most significant security challenges of the immediate post-Cold War period. It was resolved through intensive diplomacy, financial incentives, and the eventual transfer of all former Soviet nuclear weapons to Russia. But the resolution was not automatic and was not guaranteed at the outset. There were moments in the early 1990s when the nuclear governance situation in the former Soviet republics was genuinely unclear, when command and control systems were in uncertain states of transition, and when the security of nuclear weapons and nuclear materials was being maintained by personnel who were not being paid reliably and who were operating in institutions whose organizational integrity was uncertain. The Russian nuclear arsenal that emerged from the Soviet period, and that has continued to develop since, operates within a command and control framework that is the direct descendant of the Soviet system, including the perimeter system, which has been confirmed to remain operational. The perimeter system was not decommissioned when the Soviet Union ended. It was inherited by the Russian Federation, along with the rest of the Soviet nuclear establishment, and it continues to exist as a semi-automated retaliatory system designed to ensure that a Russian nuclear response could occur even if the command structure were decapitated. The system that the Soviet Union built to solve the dead-hand problem of decapitation did not disappear when the Cold War ended. It persisted because the strategic rationale that produced it persisted, and because dismantling it would have required a different kind of political decision than any that was made in the transition period. The early warning systems that generated the false alarms of the Cold War were also not fundamentally redesigned after the Cold War ended. They were updated, improved, supplemented with better sensors and more sophisticated data processing. But the basic architecture of systems designed to detect incoming nuclear attacks and provide decision-makers with very short windows in which to authorize responses remained. The pressure of response timelines remained. The fundamental tension between speed of response and avoidance of false alarms remained. The requirement that human beings make civilization-altering decisions under conditions of uncertainty and time pressure remained. The nuclear arsenals that emerged from the Cold War remained enormous relative to any deterrence requirement that could be analytically justified, and they remained deployed in ways that preserved the capability for rapid use. The de-alerting measures that arms control advocates proposed, which would have increased the time required to launch weapons and thereby reduced the risks of accidental or inadvertent launch, were implemented to a limited degree and then encountered institutional resistance. The military establishments that managed nuclear forces had designed their operations around rapid response, and changes to those operations required overcoming institutional momentum as well as genuine strategic arguments about maintaining deterrence credibility. The lessons of the Cold War's near misses were documented, studied, and taught within the relevant professional communities. The specific incidents, the false alarms, the accidents, the close calls, were analyzed and the systems were adjusted in response. But the adjustments were made within an overall framework that preserved the essential features of the system, its scale, its speed, its automated elements, and its fundamental dependence on human beings making correct decisions under extreme conditions. The history of the Cold War demonstrated repeatedly that this dependence was not always well-founded. The response to that demonstration was not to redesign the system. It was to try to improve the human factors within it through better training, better screening, better procedures, while leaving the system's architecture intact. When the Cold War ended in 1991, the command, control, and communication systems built to manage nuclear weapons continued to operate. The early warning networks continued to scan for incoming missiles. The submarines continued their patrols. The missiles in their silos remained on various states of alert. The automated systems built to ensure that a nuclear response could occur without human authorization remained in place. The institutional cultures that had evolved to manage the perpetual readiness for nuclear war did not dissolve when the political confrontation that had produced them formally ended. They were staffed by the same professionals, operating under modified but recognizable versions of the same doctrines, maintaining readiness for a conflict that had officially concluded. The systems that sustained the Cold War did not end when the Cold War ended. They persisted, along with the risks they embodied, into the period that followed, maintained by the same bureaucratic and institutional logic that had built them, because nothing in the ending of the Cold War required that they be dismantled, and because the inertia of large, complex, highly funded systems is a force that political transitions do not automatically overcome.